What if I told you that one of the most brutal, world-shaping events of the entire 20th century has been deliberately pushed into the shadows of our history books? We are talking about a catastrophe with a staggering death toll. Estimates reach as high as 4 million lives lost. It flattened an entire nation, erased cities from the map, and set the stage for 50 years of nuclear tension. This wasn't some minor border skirmish. It was a global conflagration disguised as a simple police action, and its unresolved tensions are still echoing in our headlines today. This is the story of the Korean War.
It's stuck in a weird, uncomfortable spot in our collective memory, awkwardly sandwiched between the clear-cut, celebrated victory of World War II and the televised, living room agony of Vietnam. For the soldiers who fought and survived, their homecoming was met with a deafening silence. There were no grand parades down Main Street, no national heroes welcome. They returned not to celebration, but to a quiet, unsettling indifference from a public that had largely ignored their sacrifice. Officially, in the United States, it was never even declared a war. It was sanitized with bureaucratic, almost sterile names: a police action under the authority of the United Nations, or simply the Korean conflict. But on the frozen hills and in the shattered cities of the Korean peninsula, it was anything but sterile. It was total, unrestrained, brutal war. So why was it forgotten? Why did this monumental conflict become a historical footnote? For one, the timing was terrible. The war kicked off in 1950, just 5 short years after the world had bled itself dry in the Second World War. Nations and their people were utterly exhausted by conflict and desperate for a lasting peace, not anxious for news of another far-off war. The media coverage was also sparse, at least compared to the nightly television reports that would later define the war in Vietnam. But the main reason is likely the way it ended. It didn't conclude with a triumphant victory parade or a clear, definitive resolution. It simply stopped. It ended with an armistice, a ceasefire, with the battle lines drawn remarkably close to where they had started 3 bloody years earlier. For many, this felt like a pointless, horrific stalemate that cost millions of lives for seemingly nothing. This ambiguity, this lack of a clean narrative, made it easy for the world to just turn away, to file it under unresolved and try to move on. But in doing so, the world overlooked the very conflict that would define the brutal pattern of global power struggles for the next 40 years.
So how did we get here? To understand the spark, we have to rewind to the final, chaotic days of World War II. For well over 1,000 years, Korea had been a single, unified nation with its own rich culture and history. But in 1910, that ancient kingdom was colonized by Imperial Japan, suffering decades of harsh rule. After Japan's defeat in 1945, this land was arbitrarily cut in two by the victorious superpowers. The Soviet Union occupied the north, and the United States occupied the south. The dividing line they chose, the 38th parallel, a simple line of latitude on a map, chosen with almost no regard for the geography, culture, or the millions of people it sliced through. This division was only ever meant to be a temporary administrative measure. But as the Cold War began to crystallize, freezing relations between East and West, this temporary line became a hardened, ideological border. By 1948, 2 rival, deeply hostile states had emerged from the split. In the north, there was the Soviet-backed Democratic People's Republic of Korea, led by the fervent communist revolutionary Kim Il-sung. In the south, there was the US-backed Republic of Korea, led by the fiercely anti-communist Syngman Rhee. For 2 years, tensions simmered and boiled. Skirmishes and raids along the 38th parallel became tragically common, turning the once invisible line into a tense and violent front, waiting for a final push. Then at dawn on June 25, 1950, the simmering tension exploded into open war. Backed by a formidable arsenal of Soviet-supplied tanks and heavy artillery, North Korea launched a massive, full-scale invasion across the 38th parallel. The South Korean army, ill-equipped, poorly trained, and caught completely by surprise, collapsed under the onslaught. Within just 3 desperate days, the capital city of Seoul had fallen. The remaining South Korean forces and the first hastily deployed American units were pushed back, relentlessly, day after day, into a tiny corner of the peninsula. There, they made a last stand, dug in behind a desperate defensive line known as the Pusan Perimeter. The entire country and the fate of its people was just days from falling completely to the invaders. In Washington, President Harry Truman didn't see a simple civil war. He saw something far more dangerous, the first major test of a new global order and a blatant act of communist expansion that challenged the credibility of the brand new United Nations. Acting with urgency, the UN Security Council, with the Soviet Union conveniently absent in protest of a procedural matter, authorized its member states to come to South Korea's aid. For the first time in history, a UN-led international force was going to war. The situation in the Pusan perimeter was grim, with troops hanging on by a thread. But the UN commander, the larger-than-life General Douglas MacArthur, conceived of one of the most audacious and brilliant military operations of the 20th century, the Incheon landing. In September 1950, he executed a massive amphibious assault deep behind enemy lines, hundreds of miles north of the raging front. It was a colossal, almost reckless gamble that could have ended in disaster. And it worked perfectly. The North Korean supply lines were severed, their invading army was shattered and trapped, and Seoul was liberated within weeks. The tide had turned dramatically. UN forces didn't just push the invaders back to the 38th parallel, they crossed it, driving deep into North Korea and advancing relentlessly toward the Yalu River, the border with China. That fateful decision to cross into North Korea would have consequences felt most acutely by the soldiers on the ground. Across the Yalu River, China's new communist leader, Mao Zedong, watched the American-led army approach his nation's border with growing alarm. Fearing a hostile force permanently on his doorstep, or even a potential invasion of the industrial heartland of Manchuria, he made a fateful decision. In the bitter, unforgiving winter of 1950, Mao sent hundreds of thousands of People's Volunteer Army troops swarming across the border into Korea under the cover of darkness. The UN forces, overconfident and stretched thin, were completely unprepared for what hit them. What followed was a nightmare, the longest retreat in American military history, as they were smashed and overwhelmed by the sheer force of the Chinese intervention. Freezing, exhausted, and fighting for their lives, they were driven all the way back down the peninsula. The Communists retook Pyongyang, and in January 1951, Seoul fell for a second time. By the middle of 1951, the frenetic war of movement was over. The front lines had stabilized, grinding to a bloody halt almost exactly where the war had begun, near the 38th parallel. The war of sweeping advances was finished. For the next 2 agonizing years, it devolved into a brutal, static war of attrition, a nightmarish landscape of trench warfare, constant artillery duels, and savage, pointless battles for nameless hills. While soldiers died by the thousands in the muddy, frozen trenches, ceasefire talks dragged on for over 2 years. The negotiations were frequently stalled and intensely acrimonious, snagged on many issues, but primarily on the fate of prisoners of war. In a stunning turn, many captured Chinese and North Korean soldiers refused to be sent back to their communist homelands, a point of propaganda the West seized upon and a sticking point the communists refused to accept. Meanwhile, the human cost of the stalemate was catastrophic. By the time the fighting finally stopped, it's estimated that around 3 million people were dead, the vast majority of them Korean civilians caught in the crossfire. The peninsula was in utter ruins. American bombers had dropped a staggering amount of ordnance on North Korea, more in fact than had been dropped in the entire Pacific theater of World War II, destroying an estimated 85% of its major structures. The head of U.S. Strategic Air Command, General Curtis LeMay, later made the chilling and controversial claim that the bombing campaign had killed about 20% of North Korea's population. Millions of refugees fled south, and countless families were torn apart by a new, impassable border, a painful separation that remains permanent for most to this very day. On July 27, 1953, an armistice was finally signed, but it was crucially not a peace treaty. It was simply an agreement to stop shooting. To enforce the truce, the agreement created the Korean Demilitarized Zone, or DMZ, a heavily fortified 2.5-mile-wide buffer that snakes across the peninsula. To this day, no formal peace treaty has ever been signed, meaning the Korean War is technically still not over. And this is where the conflict truly changed the 20th century. The Korean War was one of the first major proxy wars of the Cold War. It established a terrifying and repeatable new template. The superpowers, America and the Soviet Union, would now fight their ideological battles indirectly, using other nations as surrogates to do the bleeding and dying. This deadly pattern would be repeated in Vietnam, in Afghanistan, and across the globe for decades. In the United States, the war locked in the foreign policy of containment and made it far more militarized. US defense spending surged and would stay astronomically high for the remainder of the century, fundamentally reshaping the American economy into a permanent wartime footing. The war also solidified America's new post-World War II role as a global police power, ready and willing to intervene with massive force thousands of miles from its own shores. The war didn't just change policy, it redrew the map of Asia. It locked the US into a permanent military alliance with South Korea, leading to a massive American troop presence that continues today. It poisoned relations between the United States and the People's Republic of China for 2 long decades. It also led the US to guarantee the security of Taiwan after seeing the effects of communist aggression, a policy that remains a major point of global tension. The economic consequences were equally enormous. Japan, acting as a critical supply and logistics hub for the UN forces, saw its post-war economic miracle kick-started into high gear. And South Korea, a nation utterly devastated by the war, would eventually rise from the ashes to become one of the world's leading economies. Even modern medicine was transformed by the conflict's brutality. The Korean War saw the widespread implementation of mobile army surgical hospitals, or MASH units. These facilities brought life-saving care much closer to the front lines, revolutionizing trauma medicine and saving countless lives. And in society, the war was the first in which the US military was racially integrated, a historic move by President Truman that, while not perfect, helped energize the civil rights movement back home. The Korean War isn't just some forgotten footnote, it's a crucial, missing chapter in the story of the 20th century. The sheer scale of the devastation, the permanent division of a nation, and the unresolved, frozen-in-time ending left a deep scar on the world that has never really healed. North Korea's profound isolation, its paranoia, and its nuclear ambitions are a direct legacy of the war's unimaginable destruction and the unending state of conflict that followed. The heavily armed border, the tense US-China relationship, the very structure of our global security alliances all trace their modern roots back to this brutal 3-year conflict. It was a war that never truly ended, and once you see its impact, you can never truly forget. If you found this piece of hidden history compelling, be sure to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel for more stories like this, and ring the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Thank you for watching Time Scribed.